The public humiliation torture device for disobedient women. They called it a punishment for gossip, a punishment for women who spoke too much, who argued, who refused to stay silent. But the truth behind the Scold's bridle was far more sinister. This iron contraption wasn't just a device to discipline, it was a tool of public humiliation, control, and fear. In medieval Europe, especially in the UK and Germany, society created ways to suppress women's voices literally. The Scold's bridle, sometimes known as the brake, was a metal framework fitted around a woman's head. Imagine a cage made of iron straps, enclosing the skull, with a flat piece of iron inserted into the mouth. This tongue plate wasn't harmless, it was designed with sharp spikes or a rough edge. If the woman dared to move her tongue, to try and speak, the spikes would tear into her flesh. The pain was constant, even swallowing was difficult. But the physical agony wasn't the only cruelty. This was a device meant for display. The punished woman wasn't locked away in a cell where no one could see her. Instead, she was marched into the streets, shackled, her head trapped inside the bridle. Some versions even had bells attached so that with every step she took, a sharp ringing sound followed, alerting the entire town of her presence. The sound meant shame. It meant judgment, and the more people gathered to watch, the deeper the humiliation cut. The offense, sometimes it was gossip, sometimes it was nagging, sometimes it was simply defiance. Women labeled as scolds were wives who challenged their husbands, widows who demanded justice, or townsfolk who criticized local authorities. A woman's voice, especially if it disturbed the fragile egos of men in power, could quickly become her downfall, and the punishment was designed to silence the voice both literally and symbolically. Records show that the Scold's bridle appeared in legal systems as early as the 1500s. In Scotland, England, and parts of Germany, towns kept these iron masks ready for use. Municipal officials justified the device as a form of correction. They argued that it prevented disruption of public order, stopped the spread of slander, and maintained peace in the community. But beneath these excuses lay a darker truth. It was a weapon of oppression, used to control women by turning their most natural tool of expression, their voice, into a source of unbearable pain. Imagine the psychological terror. A woman forced into the bridle knew she would be paraded through her own village. Neighbors would laugh, mock, or turn away in disgust. Children would point, men would jeer, and she, trapped behind cold iron, unable to speak in her own defense, had to endure it all. Days later, even after the device was removed, the scars on her tongue, the bruises on her head, and the crushing humiliation would remain. There are stories of women being forced to wear the Scold as bridle for hours, sometimes longer, while being dragged through markets and public squares. Some were tied to posts where villagers could throw rotten food at them, spit, or insult them without consequence. The punishment wasn't just physical torture, it was a ritualized stripping of dignity. The cruelty didn't stop there. Some bridles were crafted with grotesque ornaments. One had a small figure of a pig mounted on top, mocking the victim by comparing her to an animal. Another had horns, turning her into a demonic caricature. These additions amplified the mockery, making the punishment not only painful but theatrical. Authorities wanted people to watch. They wanted the humiliation to echo louder than the woman's silenced words. But why target women in this way? To answer that, we need to look at the culture of control in medieval Europe. Patriarchal laws and customs dictated a woman's role: obedient wife, silent companion, submissive daughter. A woman who challenged the order by criticizing her husband, spreading rumors about officials, or refusing to keep quiet posed a threat to male authority. The Scold's bridle became a weapon to remind every woman of her place. One chilling account comes from Scotland, where town records describe women being marched through the streets in bridles as punishment for speaking against local ministers. In another case from England, a woman was accused of insulting her neighbor. Instead of resolving the matter privately, the court ordered her to wear the brake and be paraded around town as an example. Her crime was nothing more than words, but the punishment was iron, pain, and lifelong humiliation. The psychological scars were devastating. Survivors described feelings of shame that lingered long after the wounds healed. Some women withdrew entirely from public life, silenced by the memory of their ordeal. Others became social outcasts, their reputations forever stained by the punishment. The bridle wasn't just a temporary device. Its consequences lasted years, sometimes generations. It is important to understand that these punishments were not rare. Town councils and courts routinely used such devices, and communities often endorsed them as necessary. This wasn't the act of a few cruel individuals, it was a system, an accepted method of enforcing obedience through fear. The Scold's Bridle also reveals how torture was often dressed in the language of morality. Authorities claimed they were upholding peace, punishing lies, and maintaining public order. But in truth, they were silencing dissent and crushing the voices of women who refused to conform. Behind the iron mask was a larger story of power: who had it, and who was punished for daring to challenge it. As centuries passed, the Scold's Bridle slowly faded from use. By the 18th century, attitudes toward such punishments began to change. Public torture became less common as new ideas of law and justice emerged. Yet, the bridle remained a chilling reminder of how far societies would go to silence those they deemed troublesome. And though the device itself is gone, the shadow it cast is not. The image of women locked in iron, paraded through streets for daring to speak, tells us more than just a story of cruelty. It tells us how fragile freedom of speech was, and how dangerous it was to be a woman with a voice in a world built to suppress it. Even today, in museums across the UK and Europe, you can find examples of these cruel contraptions. Behind glass, they look cold, silent, and lifeless. But once, they were instruments of living torment. To stand before one is to imagine the muffled screams, the stares of the crowd, the crushing silence of a woman who dared to speak and was punished for it. The Scold's Bridle was more than just a piece of iron, it was a weapon of silence. Once clamped around a woman's head, she became both prisoner and spectacle. The device often contained a sharp spike or plate that pressed against or even pierced the tongue, ensuring that even the slightest attempt to speak would be met with searing pain. Imagine standing in a crowded market square, eyes fixed upon you, laughter and insults raining down, while your tongue is held hostage by cold steel. The humiliation was as deliberate as the agony. Communities justified this cruelty as discipline. A woman branded as a gossip or a scold was not just punished physically. She was branded socially. The bridle reduced her existence to a cautionary tale each time she walked through the square. Chains jangling from the mask, she became a living warning. This is what happens when a woman's voice dares to rise above silence. In many towns, officials added their own variations to intensify the shame. Some bridles were fitted with bells, so the punished could not even move without drawing attention to themselves. Each step clanged with a mocking chime, amplifying her degradation. Others included grotesque facial extensions, exaggerated noses or ears, turning the punished into an object of ridicule as well as fear. Pain alone was never enough. The punishment was designed to erode dignity itself. And yet, behind the iron mask, there was always a human being frightened, humiliated, and silenced. The bridle could cut into the flesh of the face, leaving permanent scars that marked victims long after their sentence was complete. Teeth could loosen, tongues could swell, infection could spread. The physical torment was undeniable, but the emotional scars cut even deeper. To be forced into silence in front of neighbors, friends, even family, was to be erased from the community. While still being made visible, many women who endured this punishment were never truly guilty of anything beyond speaking their mind. A disagreement with a husband, a harsh word toward a neighbor, a refusal to remain submissive. These were the crimes that could earn the iron bridle. In this way, the punishment was never really about gossip. It was about control. The device became a tool to enforce obedience, to remind women that their words, their thoughts, and even their defiance were considered dangerous. What is perhaps most disturbing is how normalized such punishments became. Public gatherings to witness women in the bridle were not unusual. Crowds jeered, laughed, and sometimes even threw objects, turning another person's suffering into a form of entertainment. It was cruelty packaged as moral order. The silence imposed by the bridle was echoed by the silence of those who stood by, complicit through their indifference. The use of the scold's bridle continued in parts of Europe for centuries, and its echoes can still be felt in how societies have policed women's voices. Though the device itself has long been retired, the ideology behind it that speaking out deserves punishment remains woven into many cultural and political structures. The bridle may have been made of iron, but its true weight was carried in the silencing of generations. Today, examples of Scold's bridles are displayed in museums, rusted but intact. They stand as chilling artifacts of how far humanity has gone in weaponizing humiliation. Looking at them now, it is impossible not to wonder about the countless stories of women whose voices were stolen, whose dignity was mocked, and whose pain was consumed as entertainment. These silent masks remind us of the brutal intersection of misogyny and authority in history. The Scold's bridle was never just a punishment, it was a statement. It declared that women's words were threats and that silence could be forged in iron. To remember these devices is not simply to recall a medieval cruelty, but to confront the ways silence is still demanded. Today, if stories like this disturb you, they should. They show how easily a society can cloak violence in the language of order. They remind us that history is not just in books or museums, it lingers in attitudes, in structures, and in unspoken rules. And it challenges us. When voices are silenced now, will we recognize the echoes of the bridle, or will we, too, remain silent? If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of history, as dark as punishments. Share this video to remind others how easily cruelty can be justified in the name of order. And remember, history's lessons mean little if we don't carry them forward.